People who survived a school shooting? What happened? Ms. Gilman had this thing about tests, where once you started, nobody left for any reason, all because she'd caught kids texting answers from the stalls 3 years ago. So when we heard what sounded like firecrackers down the hall during our AP history exam, my hand shot up immediately. Ms. Gilman didn't even look at me, just pointed to the rule posted on her wall in bold red letters. No student leaves during testing. Ms. Gilman, those were gunshots, I said, recognizing the sound from hunting with my dad every winter since I was 12. She actually laughed, that dismissive little chuckle she did when she thought we were being dramatic, before saying, "Tyler, I've been teaching for 23 years. I know construction noise when I hear it. Now eyes on your paper." My best friend Rory was sitting next to me, his pencil frozen mid-word, and when we heard another pop, 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 closer this time, maybe 2 hallways over, I watched the color drain from his face while Ms. Gilman calmly walked to her desk and typed something on her computer, probably emailing maintenance about the noise. The intercom crackled, but no announcement came through, just this weird static that made my skin crawl. Beth in the front row whispered, "My sister's class is in lockdown, she just texted me." But Ms. Gilman snapped her fingers at her, confiscated her phone, and said, "That's an automatic 0, Beth. You know the rules." I stood up, my metal chair scraping against the floor, and said, "We need to leave, now." But she moved between me and the door, her hands on her hips in that power stance she always did, saying, "Sit down, Tyler, or you'll be joining Beth with a 0. The pops were definitely getting closer, and I could hear something else now, running footsteps in the hallway above us. Kaylee started crying, mascara running down her face as she begged, "Please, Ms. Gilman, please, can we just hide?" But Ms. Gilman walked over to the door and did the worst thing possible. She locked it from the inside, trapping us in, saying, "Nobody is disrupting my test." That's when we heard actual human screaming from somewhere in the building, and half the class jumped up. But Mrs. Gilman stood firm against the door, her face red as she shouted, "The first person who moves fails this class." And I couldn't believe this was happening, that she was more worried about test integrity than our lives. Peter grabbed my arm, whispering, "The windows, we can get out the windows." But they were those safety windows that only opened 6 inches, and we were on the 2nd floor anyway, and Ms. Gilman saw us looking and actually moved her desk chair to block the window area, saying, "Don't even think about it." The footsteps were on our floor now, heavy boots, not sneakers, and they were methodical, stopping at each door, trying handles, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might throw up right there on my test paper. "Please," I tried one more time, my voice cracking. "My dad was in the military. Those are gunshots. We need to follow lockdown protocol." But she laughed again, that same dismissive sound, and said, "Your dad should have taught you to respect authority then." When we heard the door handle rattle 2 classrooms down, I made the choice that probably saved 28 lives. I picked up my desk chair and threw it through the window, safety glass exploding everywhere, and screamed, "Everybody out now!" While kids stampeded past Ms. Gilman, who was shrieking about suspension and expulsion and criminal destruction of property. Peter and I literally had to drag Beth, who was frozen in fear, and we pushed people onto the lower roof of the cafeteria, helping them drop the 8 feet to the ground, while Ms. Gilman stood there with her grade book clutched to her chest, still yelling about rules and procedures, even as we heard our classroom door handle turn behind her. The officer who interviewed me later showed me the security footage timeline on her laptop, her hand shaking as she pointed to the timestamp, and I felt my entire body go cold when I realized the shooter entered our hallway exactly 37 seconds after the last student dropped from that roof. "He had a list," she said quietly, showing me the piece of paper they'd found. "Room 237 was circled 3 times. That's your classroom." My mom grabbed my hand so tight I thought she'd break it when the agent continued. "The lockdown announcement system had been damaged in the first minute. That's why you only heard static. But your teacher had received the email alert on her computer." She showed us the screenshot. The email Mrs. Gilman had minimized to keep typing her maintenance complaint. The one marked, "Urgent. Active shooter. Initiate lockdown immediately." Time-stamped 3 minutes before I threw the chair. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever after that. My mom's fingers wrapped around mine so tight I could feel her pulse racing through her palm. Dad's jaw did that thing where the muscle jumps under his skin, the same way it did when our neighbor backed into his truck last year. Detective Mayer reached into a manila folder and pulled out another piece of paper, sliding it across the metal table toward us. The shooter's notebook page had our room number written over and over in red pen, circled so many times the paper was torn through in spots. She pointed at the dates in the margins and told us he'd been planning this for 3 weeks, had our whole AP history schedule memorized, knew we'd all be stuck in that room for the 2-hour exam period. My stomach turned when I saw he'd drawn a little diagram of our classroom with X marks where all the desks were. The detective flipped to another page showing his internet searches about our school's testing policies and how Ms. Gilman never let anyone leave during exams. Dad pushed his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor and walked to the corner of the room, his hands pressed against the wall. Mom asked if there was anything else we needed to know, but the detective just closed the folder and said she'd be in touch. We walked out to the parking lot where news vans were already setting up across the street. Dad drove us home without saying a word, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, until he pulled into a gas station about halfway there. He'd put the car in the park and just sat there staring at the dashboard while cars pulled in and out around us. His shoulders started shaking, and he said he was proud of me, but those 37 seconds kept playing in his head. I'd never seen him cry before, not even when Grandpa died, but tears were rolling down his face as he kept saying 37 seconds over and over. Mom reached over and grabbed his hand while I sat in the back seat not knowing what to do. My phone started buzzing in my pocket, and when I looked, there were already 43 messages waiting. Screenshots from news articles were spreading through our group chats, with headlines about the shooting at our school. Some kids from my class were calling me a hero for breaking the window, but others were already posting that I'd caused a panic for no reason. One message from a number I didn't recognize said I should have just listened to the teacher like everyone else. Peter texted me that people were arguing about whether I saved everyone or just made things worse by breaking the rules. Mom's phone dinged with an email notification, and she showed us the message from Principal Pennington to all parents. He called it an unfortunate incident and said the school had followed all standard protocols during the emergency. There wasn't a single word about Ms. Gilman ignoring the alert or keeping us locked in the room. He announced school would be closed for the rest of the week to review safety procedures and assess the building. Our class group chat was going crazy with everyone taking sides about what happened. Half the kids were defending. Ms. Gilman saying she was just doing her job and following the rules she'd always had. The other half couldn't believe she'd ignored an active shooter alert to protect her stupid test. Peter started taking screenshots of everything because kids were already deleting their messages when their parents saw them. Someone posted that their mom said we could all get in trouble for talking about it online before the investigation was done. Arguments broke out about whether Ms. Gilman was a victim too, or whether she'd almost gotten us killed. Kids who weren't even in our class started joining the chat to give their opinions about what we should have done. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Rory saying he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing those footsteps in the hallway, the heavy boots stopping at each door. We stayed up texting back and forth about the little things we remembered from those few minutes, how the doorknob had turned, so slowly, like someone was testing if it was locked right before I threw the chair, how Ms. Gilman's face went white when she heard the door handle behind her after we'd all gotten out, how some kids had left their phones and wallets behind in the rush to escape. Rory said he kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't broken that window. At 3 in the morning, I woke up to what sounded like a gunshot outside my window. My whole body hit the floor before my brain even processed it was just our neighbor's old car backfiring in their driveway. I was shaking so bad I couldn't stand up, my heart pounding like it was trying to break out of my chest. Mom must have heard me fall because she came in and found me curled up beside my bed. She didn't say anything, just sat down on the floor and pulled me against her while I tried to remember how to breathe normal. She rubbed my back the same way she did when I was little and had nightmares about monsters. 3 days later, we had to go back to the school to get our stuff from room 237. Parents had to sign special forms, and we could only go in small groups with security guards. The window I'd broken was already covered with plywood, and someone had swept up all the glass. Ms. Gilman was there packing boxes at her desk, keeping her eyes down while we grabbed our backpacks and books. Beth's test paper was still on her desk, with a big red 0 written across the top. My desk still had my pencil on it right where I'd dropped it when I stood up. Nobody talked while we packed our things into plastic bags the school had provided. On the way out, Principal Pennington stopped me in the hallway and asked to speak with me privately. He closed his office door and started talking about how destroying school property was a serious offense. He said the window would cost $2,000 to replace, and usually students who did something like that faced automatic suspension. His voice got quieter when he mentioned my family might be held financially responsible for the damage. He kept saying they were reviewing the circumstances, but the way he looked at me made it clear what he thought should happen. My dad was waiting in the hallway when I came out of the principal's office, and the way his face changed when he saw mine told me he already knew what Pennington had said. We drove straight to the police station, where Detective Gwyneth Mayer was waiting for us in a small interview room with a laptop and stacks of folders spread across the metal table. She had me go through everything again from the beginning, every single second from when we first heard the pops to when the last kid dropped from the roof. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as I talked, stopping me sometimes to ask about exact positions in the classroom or which direction sounds came from. She pulled up security footage on her laptop and matched my story to the timestamps, frame by frame, showing me grainy images of kids running across the cafeteria roof. The footage from our hallway showed the shooter arriving exactly 37 seconds after the last student hit the ground, just like the first officer had said. Detective Mayer pointed at the screen where you could see him trying our door handle. the one Ms. Gilman had locked from inside. She confirmed that without my actions, he would have found all 28 of us still sitting at our desks. That evening, the whole community gathered at the Civic Center for a vigil, and I sat in the back row with my parents while they read the names of the 3 students who died in other parts of the building: Sarah Hartley from the science wing, Harry Rodriguez from the library, and Jamie Walsh, who was in the bathroom when it started. Each name hit me like a punch, because that could have been us, all of us, in room 237, if I hadn't thrown that chair. The next morning, I was sitting on our front steps trying to eat breakfast when a girl with a press badge walked up our driveway. Thea Page introduced herself as a student journalist from the school paper and said she'd been hearing rumors that I'd caused unnecessary panic and wanted to get the real story out there. She had a notebook and a small recorder and asked if I'd talk to her about what actually happened. My mom came outside and started to tell her to leave, but I said I'd do it because people needed to know the truth. We sat on the porch while I went through it all again, and Thea wrote down everything, asking for specific times and checking details against what other students had told her. She'd already talked to Beth and Peter, who backed up everything I said about Ms. Gilman ignoring the warning. My parents had scheduled an emergency appointment with Radha Bhatia that afternoon, a therapist who specialized in trauma cases. Her office had these soft chairs and dim lights, and she explained that my body was stuck in survival mode, that the shaking and the jumping at loud sounds was normal after what happened. She taught me these grounding exercises where I had to name 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste. We practiced breathing techniques, and she gave me this rubber band to snap on my wrist when I felt the panic starting. That night at dinner, my dad brought up getting a lawyer, saying the school seemed more worried about covering their butts than what actually happened to us. I didn't want to make this some big legal thing, but he insisted we at least talk to someone about our options, especially after what the principal had said about the window. He'd already made some calls and found someone who dealt with school stuff. The next day, someone posted a video on Facebook that was edited to make it look like I just randomly went crazy and destroyed property. They'd cut out all the parts with the gunshots and screaming, just showing me throwing the chair and kids running. It spread through our local community groups, and suddenly my phone was blowing up with messages from people I didn't even know calling me unstable and saying I should be locked up. My mom spent hours reporting the video and trying to get it taken down, but it kept getting reposted. Thea published her article 2 days later with my full account, plus timestamps from the security footage and statements from Beth and Peter confirming everything. The comments section turned into a war zone, with some people supporting me and others saying I'd overreacted and caused unnecessary damage. At least the real facts were finally out there with evidence to back them up. Detective Mayer called me back to the station to show me something she'd found in the investigation. She had this detailed map the shooter had drawn of the building with timestamps at each location, showing his planned route. Room 237 was marked as his 4th stop, circled multiple times with an estimated arrival time that matched when he actually got there. She explained he'd studied our testing schedule and expected to find us all locked in place following standard protocol. The map showed he'd allocated 5 minutes for our classroom. Principal Pennington held a press conference the next day, where he praised the quick thinking of students without actually naming anyone. He went on about how the school had followed all procedures and how they were reviewing their safety protocols. But when reporters asked about the email alert, he just said they were investigating all aspects of the incident. Someone leaked an email thread to Thea, showing faculty messages from that morning where multiple teachers had asked about the test integrity policy during emergencies. The administration's response, sent just 2 weeks before the shooting, stated that maintaining academic standards was paramount and that test security couldn't be compromised for drills. 3 days later, my mom showed me her phone, where Ms. Gilman's union had posted this long statement about how she was just following the rules the school gave her, and the whole thing was too confusing for anyone to make good choices. They actually called her a victim too, which made me want to punch something because she saw that email and chose to ignore it while we could have died. Thea texted me that night saying someone who wouldn't give their name told her our school had covered up another incident 2 years ago where a teacher were ignored, a fire alarm during state testing, and 3 kids got smoke inhalation. The source said the teacher got transferred quietly and parents were paid off to keep quiet, but nobody would go on record because they all signed agreements. The school board announced an emergency meeting for Thursday night and said they'd stream it online for anyone who wanted to watch. And my dad helped me write down exactly what I wanted to say during public comment, even though my hands were shaking, just thinking about talking in front of all those people. When Thursday came, I sat in that big room with hundreds of angry parents and waited 3 hours for my turn, then stood at the microphone and told them about those 3 minutes between when Ms. Gilman got the email and when I threw the chair, making sure they understood she chose test rules over our lives. My voice cracked twice, but I kept going, explaining how Beth saw the alert pop up on the screen, how we begged to hide, how she locked us in while knowing there was a shooter, and when I finished, the whole room was dead quiet. The next morning, Radha asked me why I kept apologizing for the 3 kids who died in other classrooms, and she helped me understand that my brain was trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense by blaming myself for not saving everyone. She had me write down what I could control that day, which was just breaking the window and helping my classmates out, then what I couldn't control, which was everything else, including the shooter's path and the other teachers' choices. Thea came by that afternoon with a stack of papers, asking if I'd help her write really specific questions for a Freedom of Information request she was filing to get all the emergency alerts and training records from the district. We spent 2 hours writing questions like exactly when each alert was sent, who opened them, what training teachers got about emergencies during testing, and whether there were previous incidents where protocols weren't followed. Detective Mayer called me back to the station the next week and pulled out this folder with photos of the shooter's planning materials, showing me how room 237 was circled over and over on his hand-drawn map with notes about our testing schedule. She explained he'd planned to hit our room when he still had most of his ammo, right at what he called the peak of his attack, and I barely made it to the bathroom before throwing up my lunch. That same night, Beth sent me screenshots from her phone showing she'd been recording a Snapchat video of her desk when everything started, and you could actually see Ms. Gilman's computer screen in the background with the red alert box popping up. Beth's video showed Ms. Gilman looking at it, moving her mouse to minimize it, then going back to typing her email about maintenance while we sat there like sitting ducks. Some parents from the PTA started a Facebook group saying I'd made things worse by breaking the window because it could have given the shooter another way in, and they wanted me punished for what they called reckless vandalism that endangered everyone. They kept posting these long rants about how I wasn't a hero, but a panicked kid who could have gotten everyone killed by creating an access point, and my mom had to block like 30 people who were messaging us directly with threats. 2 days later, an official letter came from the district with a hearing date for next week about destruction of school property during the incident, saying I might be suspended, and my family might have to pay $3,000 to replace the safety glass window. My dad read it twice, crumpled it up, then smoothed it out and said, we needed a lawyer right now because the school was trying to make me the bad guy to cover their own butts. He called Keith Roth that afternoon, this lawyer who specialized in education law and had won a big case against a district that expelled a kid for reporting a teacher's abuse, and Keith took our case immediately. Keith filed something with the state board that same day and sent the school district a letter saying they better not delete any emails or videos or documents, because we'd need them all for evidence, and he used this legal term that meant they'd be in huge trouble if anything disappeared. That night, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table after dinner, and my mom started talking about how reporters kept calling the house asking for interviews. She wanted to change our phone number and maybe even stay with my aunt for a while, but my dad kept shaking his head and saying we couldn't let them control how our story got told. He pulled out this notebook where he'd been writing down every media request and said we needed to pick 1 or 2 trusted outlets to work with instead of hiding from everyone. My mom's hands were shaking as she sorted through the business cards reporters had left in our mailbox, and I watched them go back and forth for over an hour about whether talking would help or hurt our case. We finally agreed I'd only talk to Thea since she was a student who understood what really happened, and Keith would review anything before it got published. 3 days later, Keith called us over to his office and spread out hundreds of pages across his conference table that Thea's FOIA request had gotten back from the district. He had me help him go through each page with a highlighter marking anything about the emergency alerts, and there it was on page 247. A server log showing every teacher's email activity that morning. The log showed timestamps for when each teacher got the active shooter alert, and when they opened it, and every single teacher had clicked on it within 30 seconds, except one entry that stayed marked as unread for 16 whole minutes. Ms. Gilman's email account showed she'd gotten the alert at 10:47, but didn't open it until 11:03, which was 4 minutes after I'd already thrown the chair through the window. Keith took photos of that page and made copies, and said this was exactly the proof we needed that she'd ignored the most important message of her career. Detective Mayer called me in again the next week and explained what they'd figured out about why the announcement system hadn't worked that day. She showed me photos from the crime scene where the shooter's first shots had gone through a wall in the main office and hit the electrical panel that controlled the PA system. The backup alert system that was supposed to send texts to everyone's phones had never been turned on because the secretary thought the regular PA would handle it like always. She said it wasn't anyone's fault, really. Just bad luck that the shooter knew exactly where to shoot first. But I kept thinking about how we'd all been sitting there with no idea what was happening. 2 days after that meeting, Principal Pennington sent out another one of his carefully worded emails to all the parents talking about how the investigation was ongoing and promising appropriate action for any policy violations they discovered. He didn't name Ms. Gilman, but everyone knew who he meant when he wrote about certain staff members who might have made errors in judgment during the crisis. My dad read it out loud at breakfast and said Pennington was trying to throw Ms. Gilman under the bus to save his own job since he was the one who'd made the testing policy so strict. The next Saturday, I went to the grocery store with my mom to get stuff for dinner, and we were in the cereal aisle when a stock boy dropped a whole pallet of cans behind us. The crash was so loud and sudden that I dove behind the soup display before I even knew what I was doing, and ended up crouched on the floor with my hands over my head. My mom found me there and helped me stand up, while other shoppers stared at us and whispered to each other, and I could feel my face burning as we left our cart and walked out. In the car, I tried Radha's breathing exercise, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale, and it helped me stop shaking faster than the last time something triggered me, but I still felt sick about how everyone had looked at me. Keith must have been worried about the district destroying evidence because that Monday, he filed this formal legal letter requiring them to preserve everything related to the shooting. He explained that it meant they couldn't delete any emails or security footage or documents, because if they did now that they'd been officially notified, it would be considered destroying evidence, and they could face criminal charges. He sent copies to the principal, the superintendent, the school board, and even the IT department to make sure everyone knew they were on notice. The police held a press conference that Wednesday, where they released parts of the shooter's journal they'd found in his bedroom, and Detective Mayer warned me ahead of time that it would be hard to hear. The journal showed he'd been planning the attack for months, and had specifically picked our AP history class, because some kid in our class had apparently laughed at him in the hallway back in January, though none of us could even remember the incident. He'd written room 237 over and over in the margins, and drawn diagrams of our classroom layout, and noted that we'd all be stuck there during the exam period with no way to leave. The worst part was reading his note about how Ms. Gilman's strict testing rules meant we'd be trapped and easier targets, which made me throw up in the police station bathroom. 2 weeks went by before we got a letter from Ms. Gilman's lawyer saying she wanted to meet with me and my family to discuss what happened and try to reach some kind of understanding. Keith read the letter twice and said we should go, but not say much. Just listen to whatever she wanted to tell us and see if she was trying to apologize or trying to get us to drop our complaint. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at a neutral location, some conference room at the community center, and Keith said he'd be there with us the whole time. When Thursday came, we sat across from Ms. Gilman and her union representative at this long table, and she looked older somehow, with gray showing in her hair I'd never noticed before. She started talking about how scared she'd been that day, and how she'd made what she called a judgment error in the heat of the moment, but she kept insisting she thought she was protecting us by maintaining order. Keith had told me not to react no matter what she said, so I just sat there while she went on about her 23 years of teaching and her clean record, and how this one mistake shouldn't define her whole career. She mentioned her teaching license 4 times, but never once asked if we were okay, or said she was sorry we'd almost died in her classroom, and my mom had to grab my hand under the table to keep me from saying something. Thea had been working on this big article comparing what the school's written policies said should happen in an emergency versus what actually happened that day, and it finally went live on the news website that night. She'd found training documents that said teachers should immediately implement lockdown procedures when notified of any threat, but Ms. Gilman had done the opposite by locking us in without following any of the hiding protocols. The article included a timeline showing how the administration failed at every level, from the broken PA to the were ignored emails to the backup system never being activated, and within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. People from other states started commenting about their own schools and asking if the same thing could happen to their kids. And suddenly, our local tragedy was part of a national conversation about school safety and whether teachers really knew what to do in an emergency. The next morning, a thick envelope showed up at our door from the district's legal department, and my dad opened it while we sat around the kitchen table drinking coffee that had gone cold. Inside was this official-looking document that basically said they'd drop all the charges about the broken window if I signed away my right to talk about what happened that day. And Keith took one look at it before he started laughing, so hard he had to put his glasses on the table. He pushed the papers back across to us and told them we'd see them at the hearing instead, then pulled out his phone to call their lawyer right there in our kitchen while my mom made more coffee. I watched him pace around our living room, telling them exactly what evidence we had, including the screenshot of Ms. Gilman's minimized email, and the way his voice got quiet and serious made the district's lawyer go silent on the other end. After he hung up, Keith sat back down and explained that they were scared, because they knew they'd messed up bad, and this NDA was their way of trying to make it all go away before the public found out how badly their policies had failed. I told him I wasn't signing anything that would stop me from talking about what happened, especially when 3 kids had died while the school worried more about test rules than lives. Keith smiled and said that was exactly the right choice, then started pulling documents from his briefcase showing all the evidence we'd collected over the past few weeks. He spread them out on our dining room table like he was planning a battle, pointing to each piece and explaining how it would destroy any argument the district tried to make about me breaking school property without cause. My dad looked at all the papers and asked if we really had enough to fight them, and Keith just grinned and said we had enough to bury them if they really wanted to pursue punishment for saving 28 lives. 2 days later, the school board posted the hearing agenda online, and within hours, over 200 people had signed up for the public comment section to speak in my support. Peter texted me screenshots from the district website showing name after name registering to speak, including parents I'd never met, and even some teachers who were breaking rank to talk about the broken safety culture at our school. Ms. Rodriguez from the science department had signed up, and she'd been teaching there for 15 years, never speaking out about anything before this. The local news picked up the story about the massive turnout expected at the hearing, and suddenly my phone was blowing up with messages from classmates saying they wanted to testify about what really happened in room 237 that day. Detective Mayer called that afternoon saying she needed one final interview to complete her official report, and when she showed up at our house with her laptop and recording equipment, going through everything again felt like tearing open a wound that had barely started to heal. She had me walk through every second from when we first heard the shots to when the last student dropped from the cafeteria roof, stopping me to clarify tiny details, like exactly where Ms. Gilman was standing when she locked the door and how many seconds passed between each set of gunshots. Her questions were specific and careful, asking about things like the exact words Ms. Gilman used when she threatened to fail us, and whether I could remember seeing her computer screen from where I sat. After 2 hours of questions, she closed her laptop and looked me straight in the eyes, telling me her report would make it crystal clear that my actions prevented a massacre, and that Ms. Gilman's choices put every student in that room at risk. Keith spent the next 3 days collecting sworn statements from everyone who'd been in room 237, setting up a makeshift office in our living room where classmates could come, give their official accounts of what happened. Beth came first, still shaky, but determined to tell the truth about seeing the email alert on Ms. Gilman's screen, while our teacher typed her complaint about construction noise. Peter brought his own notes he'd been keeping since that day, including timestamps he'd written down from his phone showing exactly when things happened. Even kids who'd stayed quiet at first were showing up at our door, ready to speak up about how Ms. Gilman had ignored their pleas for safety and threatened them with failing grades while a shooter walked the halls. By the end of the week, Keith had 12 signed affidavits, all telling the same story about a teacher who cared more about test rules than student lives. My next session with Radha felt different, because instead of just processing trauma, we talked about the guilt I still carried for breaking that window and defying a teacher's direct order. She had me close my eyes and walk through the moment again, but this time focusing on what would have happened if I'd followed Ms. Gilman's commands and stayed in my seat. When I opened my eyes, she explained that breaking the window wasn't breaking rules, but following a higher moral imperative to protect life, and the guilt I felt about defying authority was actually proof of my good character, not a weakness. She said most people would have frozen or followed orders even knowing it was wrong, but I'd chosen to act when action was needed most. 3 nights later, my dad went out to move his truck and found a note tucked under the windshield wiper that said, I should have minded my own business and kept my mouth shut about what happened. The paper was just regular printer paper with block letters written in black marker, but the message was clear enough to make my hands shake when I read it. My parents called the police immediately, and within an hour, we had 2 officers at our house taking photos of the note and asking if we'd seen anyone suspicious around the neighborhood. They started doing extra patrols past our house every few hours, which made me feel both safer and more anxious, because it meant they were taking the threat seriously enough to use resources on it. The next morning, Principal Pennington sent out a memo to all families claiming the school had followed all protocols perfectly and that no policies had been breached during the incident. Thea texted me within minutes of the email going out, already digging through her files, and within 2 hours, she'd found the smoking gun we needed. She'd gotten copies of training slides from the previous year's mandatory safety workshop that directly contradicted every claim in Pennington's memo, including one slide that specifically said, teachers must immediately implement lockdown procedures upon receiving any threat notification, not wait for verbal confirmation. The slides also showed that classroom doors should be locked from the outside during lockdowns to prevent anyone from entering, not from the inside, which would trap students. Exactly what Ms. Gilman had done wrong. Thea posted side-by-side comparisons of Pennington's claims and the actual training materials on the news website, and within an hour, it had been shared over 1,000 times with parents demanding answers about why the principal was lying about what happened. 2 days later, an IT specialist who'd been helping with the investigation sent Keith something that made him actually gasp out loud when he opened the email attachment. It was a screenshot pulled from backup servers showing Ms. Gilman's computer screen at the exact time of the incident, and there in her minimized tabs was the bright red emergency alert email marked, Urgent, Active Shooter, while her active window showed her half-finished email to maintenance complaining about construction noise disrupting her test. The timestamp on the screenshot was 3 minutes and 14 seconds before I threw the chair through the window, proving she'd seen the alert and chosen to ignore it while continuing to type her complaint. Keith immediately filed this as evidence for the hearing, and I heard him on the phone with the district's lawyer saying they might want to reconsider their position unless they wanted this image on the front page of every newspaper in the state. That afternoon, the local radio station announced they'd be hosting a debate between the teachers' union representative and a school safety expert about the incident and what it meant for emergency procedures going forward. The union rep spent most of the hour pivoting away from specific questions about Ms. Gilman's actions, just repeating that teachers were trained to follow established procedures and maintain order during any disruption. Meanwhile, the safety expert calmly explained how those exact procedures were fatally flawed and had been designed for a different era when school shootings weren't a real threat, pointing out that rigid adherence to rules during an active shooter situation was literally the worst possible response. Keith picked me up early the next morning, and we spent 4 hours in his office going over every single detail of what happened that day. He had me tell the story over and over, until I could say it without my voice shaking, without getting angry when he played devil's advocate and asked if maybe I'd overreacted to construction noise. He taught me to pause before answering, to keep my hands still on the table, to look directly at whoever was asking questions, even when they tried to make me feel small. We practiced with him pretending to be the board members, throwing every awful question he could think of at me, while I sat there in my dad's only suit that Mom had to safety pin in the back to make it fit. The morning of the hearing, my stomach was so twisted, I couldn't eat breakfast. And when we walked into that conference room at the district office, I saw 12 board members sitting behind a long table like judges. I sat down at the small desk they'd put in the middle of the room, my parents behind me, Keith beside me with his briefcase full of evidence. The superintendent started by reading the charges against me for destroying school property, and I had to sit there silent while he made it sound like I'd just randomly decided to trash a classroom. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up, even though Keith said I didn't have to, and I told them exactly what happened, starting with the first pops we heard during the test. I explained about recognizing the sound from hunting with my dad, about Beth's text from her sister, about the static on the intercom because the system was already damaged. I kept my voice steady when I described Ms. Gilman locking us in from the inside, trapping 28 students while she typed her email complaint about noise. The board members started shifting in their seats when I got to the part about hearing the door handle rattle 2 classrooms away, about making the choice to throw the chair through the window. One board member actually gasped when I said the shooter entered our hallway 37 seconds after the last student dropped from that roof. Detective Mayer went next, and she didn't mess around with opinions or feelings, just laid out the facts with timestamps and evidence photos. She showed them the shooter's notebook with room 237 circled 3 times, explained how his path would have brought him to our room at the height of his ammunition supply. She stated clearly that based on the evidence and the timeline, my actions directly prevented what would have been the deadliest part of the attack. The IT specialist's screenshot got passed around showing Missy Gilman's computer screen with the emergency alert minimized while she typed about maintenance. Then, Ms. Gilman's attorney stood up, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing as he said she'd been confused and scared, that she thought she was maintaining order in a chaotic situation. He said she admits she received the alert, but didn't understand its urgency, and she offers her sincere apologies to the students for any distress her actions may have caused. The word may made my dad's jaw clench so hard I could hear his teeth grinding from where I sat. The board went into closed session for 45 minutes while we all waited in the hallway, my mom holding my hand so tight, my fingers went numb. When they called us back in, the superintendent read their decision in this flat voice like he was reading a grocery list. They imposed a 30-day unpaid suspension on Ms. Gilman plus mandatory crisis management retraining, but they wouldn't fire her because she had 23 years of otherwise good service. They dropped all disciplinary action against me, and formally acknowledged what they called my heroic actions under extreme duress, but you could tell they hated having to say it. 2 days later, the district held a press conference announcing new safety protocols they claimed had been in development for months, which was total garbage, but at least the changes were real. They installed redundant alert systems, gave both students and staff authority to initiate lockdowns, and redesigned all the emergency drills to actually make sense. Principal Pennington had to stand at that podium and publicly apologize for threatening me with disciplinary action, and even though his words sounded like someone else wrote them, at least it went on record. Keith spent the next 3 weeks negotiating with the district's lawyers, and they finally agreed to pay for all my therapy sessions, implement the safety upgrades we demanded, and establish a counseling fund for every student affected that day. They also had to issue a formal commendation for my actions, which got framed and hung in the main hallway, even though seeing it there made me feel weird every time I passed it. Thea published her final article about everything that had happened, and she was careful to focus on the survivors and the actual changes we'd forced the district to make instead of turning it into disaster porn. She interviewed 17 students from our class, and every single one said they wouldn't be alive if I hadn't thrown that chair, which was hard to read, but important for people to understand. After 2 months of twice-weekly sessions with Radha, she told me I was making real progress with managing the trauma. The nightmares had gone from every night to maybe twice a week. I could hear sudden loud noises without completely freezing up, and I'd learned breathing techniques that actually helped when the panic started creeping in. We made a long-term plan for continuing therapy, tapering down to once a week, then eventually once a month, with the understanding that healing from something like this takes time, and there would be setbacks. She taught me that getting better didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it was okay, just learning to carry it without letting it crush me. 3 weeks later, they finally let us come back to the school, though not to room 237, which stayed locked with yellow tape across the door like a crime scene. They put our whole AP history class in the library instead, these long tables where we couldn't sit in our old spots. And the first morning back, I walked in to find Rory already there, saving me a seat next to him and Peter. My hands shook, holding my new textbook because they'd thrown out everything from that room. Even our old tests, and the substitute teacher kept looking at us like we might break. Kids from other classes stared at us in the hallways, some with this weird respect, others whispering about the window I broke, and I just kept my head down walking between classes. The new classroom had windows that opened all the way and 2 exits, which the sub pointed out 3 times that first day, and I noticed how everyone kept checking both doors during class. After school, Rory grabbed my arm, and we walked without talking to the memorial garden they'd planted near the football field for the 3 students who died. Fresh dirt surrounded 3 small trees with plaques I couldn't read through the blur in my eyes, and we stood there for maybe 20 minutes not saying anything while other kids left flowers and notes. Rory finally squeezed my shoulder, and I squeezed back, both of us knowing we'd been 37 seconds from having our own trees there. 2 days later, my mom handed me an envelope that came to the house with no return address, just my name written in the careful cursive I recognized from 3 years of corrections on my essays. The letter inside was 2 pages of Ms. Gilman's tight handwriting admitting she'd been wrong, that she'd let her need for control override basic safety, that she was transferring to a district in another state and wouldn't ask for my forgiveness because she knew she didn't deserve it. I read it 4 times, then handed it to my dad, who read it once and fed it into the shredder, saying some apologies come too late to matter. Detective Mayer called that Friday to say she was closing the investigation and mailing us the final report, which arrived in a thick manila envelope with a red stamp marking it confidential. Page 14 had the commendation she'd written about my decisive action under extreme duress, saving 28 lives, but the words felt empty compared to the weight that still sat on my chest every morning. The school district scheduled a meeting where they wanted student input on the new safety protocols, and I signed up even though being in those administrative offices made my skin crawl. We spent 3 hours going through every detail of the new system where anyone could trigger a lockdown. Teachers had discretion to evacuate, and the drills actually made sense instead of trapping kids like sardines. During the first new drill 2 weeks later, when the alarm sounded, our substitute immediately opened both exits and told us to make smart choices, and we evacuated to the football field in under 90 seconds. The district held this small ceremony in the auditorium where Principal Pennington had to stand at the podium and present commendations to me, Peter, Beth, and 5 other students. I kept my speech to 14 words about community and change, watching my parents in the 3rd row nodding while Pennington's jaw stayed clenched the whole time. By the time summer came, I'd found this rhythm that felt almost normal, working morning shifts at the hardware store my dad's friend owned, carrying bags of mulch and sorting screws while my hands learned to be steady again. Radha cut our sessions to once a week, then every other week, saying I was processing things well, though she kept her phone on for me all the time just in case. The nightmares faded from every night to maybe once a week, usually the same one where I couldn't break the window no matter how hard I threw the chair. I started running in the early mornings when the streets were empty, passing the school on my route, even though there were other ways to go. 4 months to the day after everything happened, I was jogging past the main entrance when construction workers renovating the damaged wing dropped a steel beam that hit the concrete with this massive clang that echoed off the buildings. My whole body tensed, and I stumbled but kept running, my breathing staying controlled the way Radha taught me, and I made it all the way home without stopping. Standing in my driveway, catching my breath, I realized the sound hadn't sent me to the ground like it would have even a month ago, and maybe that was what getting better looked like. Not forgetting, but learning to keep moving when the world made sudden loud noises. Thanks for letting me poke around these questions with you today. Really hope my little wonderings were worth your time. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.